right? What's going on here? Why didn't we just back off? Starting in 1994 was to expand NATO eastward. We thought we could shove it down their throat. We think we're Godzilla. We think it's still the unipolar moment.
So recently, John Mearsheimer was on Tucker Carlson's podcast talking about why he believes NATO shouldn't even exist at all anymore, why it's a remnant from the Cold War that now exists only to stir up new tensions and new animosities toward Russia, and what can be done about that today and how it's influencing today's foreign policy. So he's one of the best geopolitical analysts of our time, in my estimation. So let's get his take on that. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
You spent 10 years in the U.S. military, graduated West Point during the Cold War.
Yes.
So your life for 10 years was focused on the Soviets, of course.
No question.
No question. So that's 10 years. That's a long time in your young life. How were you able to transition mentally from viewing Russia as an enemy to viewing them as, another country?
It's an interesting question.
And why weren't others able to do that?
Well, a lot were, but a lot weren't. I think that what happened was that during the Cold War, when I started to think about the U.S.-Soviet competition, the subject that I got interested in was the conventional balance of forces in Europe. It was the NATO Warsaw Pact balance. And I wrote my dissertation on the subject of conventional deterrence, and it focused on the NATO Warsaw Pact balance. And my argument was, which was very controversial at the time, was that the Soviets were not 10 feet tall, and that actually if a war did break out in Central Europe, the West or NATO would do very well, that we would hold off the Soviets, that they would not win a quick and decisive victory, which was the conventional wisdom at the time. So in a very important way, I was engaged in threat deflation. I always thought when you looked at the Soviet Union, this is during the latter part of the Cold War, when I was coming of age, that we greatly overestimated the threat and that the Soviet Union was not 10 feet tall. So once the Cold War ends and then we segue into the unipolar moment, I'm already moving in that direction.
Yeah, it's also to be said that they became a greater threat when the U.S. got embroiled in stupid proxy wars against the Soviet Union, much like they do today, but they got embroiled in Vietnam and in Korea and in other places where it was so fruitless and senseless, and almost everything that the U.S. did at that time was a total indictment against this idea that we would have to stop communism there before it came over here. This was, the domino theory that was laid out by people like George Kennan and others. And George Kennan ultimately became a hero. He was one of the forces that helped, quell the animosities and bring peace and bring about the dissolution of the Soviet Union diplomatically without large-scale bloodshed. And, even I think he recognized that toward the end of his life.
And then during the 1990s, the Soviet Union, which has become Russia, is a total basket case. I mean, it's the only threat that it represents is to itself.
Yes.
It doesn't represent a threat to the West. And in fact, Tucker, NATO expansion, which really gets going in 1994, that's when Bill Clinton decides to expand NATO, is not designed to contain Russia because there is no Russian threat. So then Putin comes to power, and what happens from about 2000 up until the present is that the West, and here we're talking about the United States as well, of course, becomes increasingly Russophobic and hostile to Putin. And I think it's in large part because Putin stands up to us. I think that we get used to the idea, certainly in the 1990s, that we call the shots. It's the unipolar moment. And when we tell countries to jump, their only question is how high.
Yeah, he's totally right, especially when it comes to Putin in our involvement in Syria and the war propaganda that accompanied it. If you remember back to Obama's presidency when he talked about, hey, we have to overthrow Assad. Assad just gassed his own people. And you had that whole foray into a new propagandistic effort to enact another regime change in the Middle East, and that was Syria. Well, U.S. troops moved in. They conducted some bomb strikes. There were limited bomb strikes, and it looked like regime change was on the table right there. But then Russia moved into Syria and denied the U.S. a regime change. And that is really what made Putin persona non grata to the U.S. foreign intelligence apparatus, for sure, and to the political establishment, is he stopped a regime change by the U.S. by moving into there. And that was why it became a campaign issue. There was this idea, amongst populist Republicans at the time, that Hillary would start World War III with Russia over Syria. And that was reason to elect Trump. Of course, in Trump's presidency, shortly after he took office, I think just months into it, maybe 5 or 6 months, they were putting boots on the ground in Syria. So that's what you have. But he's right about U.S. antagonism, not only in the waves of NATO expansion, but also deciding to bomb a European capital for over a month in Serbia, Belgrade, for 42 days. I don't think Putin really liked that too much. And, as we got closer and closer to 2014, the writing was on the wall that this was antagonism leading up to the U.S. overthrow of the Yanukovych government, which was elected by the people of Ukraine, but overthrown by the U.S. It wasn't a totally organic effort. This was done to insert a more antagonistic government toward Russia rather than one that wanted neutrality like Yanukovych. So, yeah, he's right.
And we get away with that to some extent with Putin to begin with. But then he begins to play hardball with us. And he gives a very famous speech in Munich in 2007 where he throws down the gauntlet. And from 2007 forward, relations really deteriorate. And as they deteriorate, the Russophobia comes racing to the fore and remains firmly in place today.
Yeah, and one of the key events, too, I missed was the 2008 Bucharest summit, in which this was at the end of George W. Bush's administration. In Bucharest, Bush just straight up said that Georgia and Ukraine would be part of NATO. Again, this is the reddest of red lines for Russia. We know that from the undisclosed "yet means yet" memo by William Burns, who was the CIA director at the time, writing to Condoleezza Rice saying, hey, I've surveyed all the factions within Russia, and the idea of including Ukraine in NATO is a disaster. That's what they call the reddest of red lines. That would guarantee a military excursion if the U.S. tries to do that. Well, the U.S. kept flirting with that. I also think I was mistaken earlier. It wasn't George Kennan that came up with the domino theory, but the containment theory. That's what I meant there.
What is the point of NATO now? Like, why do we still have NATO? What's its objective?
Well, I think if you asked most Europeans and even many Americans in the American foreign policy establishment, the argument would be that NATO serves as a pacifier. In other words, it keeps the peace in Europe.
Not if you're Afghanistan or the Balkans or Libya. It doesn't keep the peace, and it's not a defensive alliance. It's an offensive alliance hell-bent on antagonizing other countries. And that's what Russia views it as, I think rightly so.
The United States is the most powerful state in NATO, and the United States sits on top of all the European countries. It provides security for them. It provides a nuclear umbrella for them. And that prevents the European countries from engaging in security competition with each other. So we are a pacifying force.
Yeah, we also subsidize the security of other countries, which is just as wrong when it comes to Europe as it is in Israel. Who foots a lot of that bill? It's the U.S. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, as long as NATO serves as the American wing or the European wing of the American empire. That's what NATO is. It's there to antagonize Russia and bring about a new Cold War, to drive a new Cold War down the throats of the Russians, who are now incentivized to be drawn closer to the allies in China and India and Iran and Syria, these BRICS countries, and Brazil.
And this is the reason that the Europeans today...
To prevent intra-European conflict?
Intra-European conflict, right.
Interesting.
Well, if you think about it, up until 1945, when World War II ends, you had two world wars in the first half of the 20th century. And then if you go back in time, European countries had been fighting against each other almost since the beginning of time.
Well, that's why there are so many European countries and so many languages and different distinct cultures. I mean, you might also make the argument that's why Europe was so successful. because they were.
You can certainly make that argument, and you can make the argument that that's why they were able to conquer huge chunks of the planet and create these empires, because they were very good at projecting military
These
power.
were martial societies before they became tourist destinations.
Yes, but anyway.
Well, they are also very successful in piling corpses on top of each other for fruitless wars designed to just serve the king in power at the time. That was the story of the Great War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the Franco-Prussian War. There were little points to any of that on a moral compass whatsoever, other than just fighting for crown and glory. And, it's horrific. So yeah, Europe benefited economically by becoming economic powerhouses, but it wasn't a result of the wars, which depleted legions of young men and, was a huge setback to their economy. So I'm not sure I follow this completely.
What happens during the Cold War is the Soviets dominate one side of Europe and we dominate the other side of Europe. And as long as those two great powers are dominating those two halves of Europe, the countries located below them cannot fight among themselves. Okay? So what happens when the Cold War ends in 1989 and then into the 1990s is that we decide that we're going to expand NATO eastward. And as I said to you, it's very important to understand that when we expand NATO eastward in the 90s and then in the early 2000s, we're not aiming at containing Russia. What we're interested in doing is taking the pacifier, the American pacifier that sits over Western Europe, and putting it over Eastern Europe and making Europe one giant zone of peace. And the Europeans liked that idea. You want to remember, after 1989, lots of Europeans were very worried about Germany, which reunified when the Cold War ended.
Yes.
And you can understand why Europeans were very nervous.
Yes.
Yeah, but Boris Yeltsin's Russia wasn't the same as Stalin's Russia. These were the heroes that overthrew the villains of the Soviet Union. And if you ask me, Gorbachev is one of the biggest heroes of our time, maybe in the last century, because he had Soviet loyalists around him, former commissars, and, people speaking to him, people from the days of Stalin and Khrushchev saying, hey, you can't allow these autonomous elections to occur in other places in the Soviet Union. Your regime is about to collapse. You have to roll in the tanks right now. And he would never do it. Instead, he imposed glasnost and perestroika and liberalized. And that is incredibly heroic. And it needs to be said that Russia was amazingly and remarkably, conciliatory toward the West by allowing NATO to stand even beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union, because after all, they agreed to collapse the Warsaw Pact.
But as long as the Americans stay in Europe, as long as NATO remains intact, the pacifier is there. Most people don't realize this, but the Soviets and then the Russians were perfectly content to see the United States remain in Europe and for NATO to remain intact after the Cold War.
Right.
Because the Soviets/Russians understood that we served as a pacifier. What they didn't want, and they made this very clear, was NATO expansion. And of course, what we did, starting in 1994, was to expand NATO eastward, again, to move the pacifier from over just Western Europe to over all of Europe.
Yeah, absolutely right. This is a great point. I covered it a little bit before he went in this direction. But yeah, it wasn't NATO that was viewed as an existential threat by the new Russian government. It was NATO expansion that would push that alliance right up against its border, where it is now, essentially, with the U.S. treating Ukraine as essentially a de facto NATO power, especially when it comes to the amount of funding it's gotten. It's gotten about $200 billion in U.S. taxpayer money, by the way, that is extorted from all of us, by the way, to serve this insane proxy war where there hasn't even really been major territorial changes in over 3 years. And Zelensky remains there, expanding conscription laws, outlawing rival political parties, shutting down Eastern Orthodox churches, outlawing oppositional political parties, and this is still all for democracy. Yeah, well, we see through that now. And we know, again, that this was the worst case scenario for Putin. Putin actually drafted up what's called the draft treaty and sent it to NATO, I think, in the later months of 2021 before he invaded during what was the Russian, the civil war in the Donbass had already been proceeding for 7 years. He sent a draft treaty to NATO that said, hey, if you just put it in writing, if you just agree to basic terms, including that Ukraine will never be a part of NATO, I won't invade Ukraine. And instead of doing that, Jens Stoltenberg, who was the general secretary of NATO, just laughed at it and boasted that, well, no, he's going to get fighting now. Because we're not doing that. We're not promising that Ukraine isn't going to be part of NATO. So they threw away the opportunity to make peace there, just as Zelensky did in the first months of the war with the Istanbul conference, where he could have walked away from this peacefully. And guess what? Zelensky's never going to get another deal like that again.
And that is what has produced the catastrophe in Ukraine.
By the time NATO gets to the Baltics, and then we start talking openly, as the Biden administration did, just openly, like at press conferences about moving NATO into Ukraine, it's very obvious that that's going to trigger a conflict with Russia at some point. How could it not?
Yeah, and again, they were open about this in the Nyet means Nyet memo. And the U.S. representative, I should say, the ambassador to Ukraine at the time, he later became the CIA director under Biden, William Burns, put this emphatically to Condoleezza Rice. But the Bush administration didn't care. They said Ukraine and Georgia will be part of NATO. Kamala Harris often said that Ukraine will be part of NATO. Jake Sullivan and Blinken talked about it as well. NATO voted against it, but you had constant clamoring and lobbying from Zelensky and the powers closest to him to do that and to do other lunatic maneuvers like impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Another thing that would trigger a hot war with Russia, a nuclear power. It's so absurd.
Why didn't anyone pause and say, okay, NATO's great. Obviously, there's a massive budget. We're all getting richer from NATO also. But let's balance that against like a war with Russia. We don't want that. Did anyone raise that point?
Couple points. Just to get the dates right, the second big tranche of NATO expansion, which brings the Baltic states in, is 2004.
Yep.
The first big tranche is 1999. That's Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, 99. Then 2004 is when the Baltic states come in. 2008 is when the critical decision is made, April 2008, to bring Ukraine into NATO. Okay? To get to the heart of your question, what's very interesting is if you go back and look at many of the planning documents from the 90s about NATO expansion, people recognize at the time that Ukraine is a special case, and it will be a huge source of trouble if we move NATO into Ukraine. So you can get away with Poland, you can even get away with the Baltic states, but Ukraine is a different matter. And it's very important to understand that we understood that from the get-go. So the question then becomes, which you're asking, is why did we do it, right? What's going on here? Why didn't we just back off? And I think the answer is we thought we could shove it down their throat. You want to understand, they opposed the 99 expansion, the first tranche. We just shoved it down their throat.
Yeah, what's Boris Yeltsin going to do about it?
That's right. That's exactly right. What's he going to do about it? Mm-hmm. And then 2004, Putin's in control now. We shove it down their face, down their throat again. So in 2008, immediately after NATO says at the April 2008 NATO Bucharest summit, immediately after he says that NATO says that Ukraine will be brought into NATO, Putin makes it manifestly clear that this is unacceptable, that this is an existential threat, and that Russia will not let it happen. And by the way, at that April 2008 NATO summit, they said they were not only going to bring Ukraine into NATO, they're going to bring Georgia into NATO. That's April 2008. A war breaks out in Georgia in August of 2008 over this very issue. So you would expect us to back off at that point, but we don't back off.
No, instead, the US pushes into Ukraine, plays a role in overthrowing its government in 2014, flirts with it coming into NATO yet again, and, by the way, during Trump's first term, supplies them with offensive capable weaponry capable of firing nuclear warheads. That is the Aegis missile system, where you can attach an H-bomb to the top of a Tomahawk. That's what they give Ukraine. This would not be acceptable if it was Mexico doing this in the Russia doing this in the United States and Mexico, providing them with arms, flirting with them getting into their military alliance, overthrowing Mexico's government to replace it with a government that was openly hostile toward the United States. This would not fly. And guess what? We have evidence that it didn't fly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when this played out to something of a similar extent. And you saw what kind of crisis that was and how the US President Kennedy responded to it. So no, this is not acceptable. And you can see from the Russian perspective, and this is whether you like Russia's government or not. I don't like any governments personally, including my own. You can see why they did not like this very much.
In fact, we double down. And then when the crisis first starts, this is in 2014, February 22nd, 2014. That's when the crisis starts. That's when the Russians take Crimea. This is when you understand, or should understand, the Russians mean business. Do we back off? Do we try to accommodate the Russians in any way? Absolutely not. We plow forward. And then, of course, we get the war in 2022. And you ask yourself, why did we do this? And by the way, if you look at the process, the decision-making process after Joe Biden moves into the White House in January 2021, and then 13 months later, the war breaks out, Biden makes no effort whatsoever to accommodate the Russians. So again, the question is why? What's going on here?
Yes.
We're just going to shove it down their throat. We think we're Godzilla. We think it's still the unipolar moment.
That's right, man. These people are just absurd in their way of thinking. The people who rule over us, control our foreign policy, despite the fact about what Americans have to say about it. Look, this is classic empire building, and it's a pitfall to any country that engages in it. It certainly will lead to the demise of the United States, expanding too far into the empire phase. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing bases around the world, staffed with hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers. They're sold a lie that they're fighting for the safety and security of the United States, when the United States doesn't really face any threats like that. No one's on the verge of invading the United States. No, the United States wants to engage in empire building. That's why it shouldn't even be called the Defense Department. In the U.S. case, it's clearly the Offense Department. These schemes are so absurd. And, what the founders said about this was clear. And a lot of the founders disagreed with each other on a lot of things. But people from around the political spectrum of that time, whether you're a Federalist or a Republican, the Jeffersonians said that, hey, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, should be the cornerstone principle of America. That's what Jefferson himself announced in his first inaugural. George Washington, on the other hand, generally thought of as a Federalist, technically not really aligned with a faction, though he did side with the Federalists more times than not. He said that, this is just a total mistake, because you embroil yourself in these foreign entanglements and you just inherit all of the enemies of your allies. And that's just a fact. Like, that's what we've seen play out entirely, especially during my lifetime and especially during the last century. I mean, we get that from the alliance with Israel. We get that from our alliance, so to speak, from Ukraine. And these alliances aren't reciprocal whatsoever. We don't get any benefit from Israel other than paying hardship debt and bankrolling genocide. And we don't get any help from Ukraine outside of constant debt and brinksmanship with nuclear power. So they set upon a new Cold War, and it's bipartisan. This happened beginning in Clinton's presidency. Mearsheimer's right. In 1994, the different waves of NATO expansion unfolded. There were other things in between. There was the Bucharest summit. There was bombing Serbia. There was, the coup in Ukraine. There was Trump unilaterally withdrawing from the INF treaty, which had banned the usage of a certain class of missiles against each other. We no longer have that either. And of course, now it's this proxy war with Russia, which doesn't seem to be abating anytime soon. In many ways, Trump is fanning the flames of it. So yeah, Mearsheimer is right. Our regime, the criminal regime that rules over us, and again, it's a bipartisan effort, acts like we're still in the unipolar moment when the U.S. was the only superpower in the world and can just impose its power upon everyone, regardless of the circumstances. Well, we're not in 1991 anymore. The U.S. can't do that, and nothing is more clear from the events that have unfolded in recent history to prove that. But I do want to hear from you guys on that. Let me know down below. Should NATO exist at all? What is its purpose now? Are you with me? Does it only serve as an entangling alliance that provokes tensions in the world? Let me know in the comments below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Tucker as well, and please consider becoming a YouTube member of my channel by clicking the join button below. If you do that, you'll help support the channel, which I appreciate, and in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.